Have you ever felt the irresistible pull to set someone straight, to correct an error, or defend yourself against a misunderstanding? It's a universal impulse, the sudden quickening of the spirit, the flush of words that leap to your lips, the burning need to prove, to explain, to be understood. Yet, if we are honest, a strange thing often happens. The more passionately we argue, the more stubborn our opposition becomes. We circle, point, correct, only to find ourselves barricaded in a battle that leaves both sides more entrenched and less enlightened than before. Why, then, do so many of us get caught in this relentless cycle? Or more pointedly, why should the wise, those who see further than most, choose never to argue at all? Pause for a moment and consider the last time you found yourself in a heated exchange, maybe with a colleague, a friend, a partner, or even a casual stranger smudging history on the internet. Did it end in harmony, or were you left feeling drained, perhaps even diminished? The world is brimming with opinions, each polished by its owner like a cherished stone, each carried forward with conviction regardless of wear or worth. In these collisions of certainty, the urge to explain oneself becomes a throbbing demand. Let me make you see what I mean. Let me correct your errors so we can move forward as one. But at what cost? Is this urge, as it turns out, a doorway not to peace or understanding, but to entanglement and regret? Here lies the subtle trap. To argue, to defend your truth before those unwilling to hear it, is to step willingly onto a stage built for conflict, not resolution. It is to offer the most valuable thing you possess, your energy, your time, your equanimity, into an arena where it will only be spent and seldom, if ever, returned. In this light, what appears as courage or conviction often reveals itself as vulnerability. The wise, learning from history and experience, know that true power does not reside in the thunder and flash of debate, but in the calm, measured refusal to be drawn in at all. To withdraw, to maintain silence, to let one's dignity stand untouched by petty quarrels, here is the quiet fortress of true strength. What if restraint, not rebuttal, is the greater act? What if silence, rather than a sign of submission, is the ground from which all real influence and self-mastery grow? The wise person knows to refuse to argue is not to tolerate untruth or injustice, but to hold oneself in reserve, to remain inwardly free, unsullied by the need to conquer or convert. This is not merely passive avoidance, but something far bolder, a conscious, strategic withdrawal from battles unworthy of one's attention. To shed light on this, we need only look to Machiavelli, not the caricature of the cold-hearted schemer, but the discerning observer of power and its perils. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, even words were weapons, and every conversation risked collapse into chaos. Machiavelli understood what so many around him did not, that the most formidable players were not the loudest or the most insistent, but those able to shape events through patience, indirectness, and the art of letting others expend themselves in fruitless noise. He walked among men who would ruin reputations in public and whisper alliances behind closed doors, and learned that exposure and explanation were dangerous commodities. But Machiavelli was not alone. From the Stoic philosophers of Athens, who counseled tranquility in the face of provocation, to the ancient Taoists, who praised the power of wu-wei, action through non-action, the wisest have always known that restraint is not weakness, but a higher form of engagement. Even in modern psychology, a principle echoes this, that in refusing to validate every challenge with a counter-argument, we often diffuse rather than escalate, preserving not only our peace, but also our authority. This insight, you see, does not belong to any era or domain alone. The value of refusing to argue is not reserved for the political intrigue of long-dead courts. It is just as alive in the hallway at work, the breakfast table, the scroll of a digital feed, or the heat of a romantic spat. The contexts change, the faces, the costumes, the particular words, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Where pride demands immediate vindication, dignity waits. Where smallness rushes to reply, wisdom stands aloof. What then might happen if you began to cultivate this kind of discipline in your own life, not as a pose, but as a genuine shift in orientation? Think of it. The next time you feel that heat in your chest, the insistent voice demanding a comeback, could you pause instead? Could you allow another the final word, not because you are defeated, but because you see, with a wider gaze, the cost of convincing the unwilling? Might you, by refusing to argue, paradoxically gain in authority and peace? This is the heart of what I hope to explore with you. A reflection not simply on silence for its own sake, but on the ancient, psychological, and deeply practical wisdom of knowing when to speak and, more crucially, when not to. This is a choice that can transform not only our relationships and reputations, but even our understanding of ourselves, shifting us from the reactive trap of pride to the steady ground of dignity. If you walk with me through these questions, you may begin to see that the greatest victories are seldom won through debate, and the deepest influence rarely requires a single word. There are truths, sometimes, that can only be spoken in silence. And there is a wisdom, hard-earned and often misunderstood, in refusing to argue, not out of weakness, but out of a quiet and unassailable strength. Shall we see where this path leads? If we peer honestly into the writings of Machiavelli, particularly those infamous lessons wound tightly through the sinews of the prince, what emerges is not a simple blueprint for tyranny, but a brutal mirror reflecting that age-old question: what really moves the levers of human affairs? Machiavelli, often painted with the brush of cold calculation, offers, beneath the surface, a startling insight about the nature of power, perception, and control, not just over others, but over ourselves. Let's pause for a moment on one of his most arresting notions, that those who wish to hold power or simply swim safely through the turbulent waters of the world must resist the naive urge to argue. Why? Because argument reveals. It's in the heat of debate that our motivations, loyalties, and even our deepest insecurities are laid bare. Imagine two figures locked in debate, their passions rising, words sharpening like daggers. Now step back. Who has lost control of the room? Who becomes transparent, predictable, even pitiable? It is rarely the one who holds tightly to their words, but rather the one who unleashes them freely, unable to rein in that compulsion to be right. Machiavelli saw that argument is, paradoxically, a self-betrayal. By letting yourself be drawn into open confrontation, you relinquish the faculty that preserves influence, ambiguity. As soon as we begin justifying ourselves, we anchor ourselves in the expectations and judgments of others. In becoming reactive, tethered to every arrow flung our way, we lose the initiative and, gradually, our strength. The door is thrown open to manipulation. You become a puppet whose strings are pulled not by your own subtle will, but by any tongue clever enough to provoke. Ask yourself, when did obsessively proving your point ever leave you stronger than before? History, that ever-present tutor, demands we look at the cost of such moral fervor. Recall Savonarola, the firebrand priest whose furious sermons torched the consciences of Florence, setting the proud city ablaze with conviction. Against him stood the Medici, patient, watchful, quietly regrouping as the tumult raged. Savonarola argued with thunder and lightning, the Medici, with silence and chess master's grace. The outcome? The people who once cheered Savonarola soon grew weary of ceaseless confrontation. Thunder grows exhausting. Silence, by contrast, can terrify, can invite reflection, and can regroup forces unseen. Savonarola's demise was not just a failure of power, but a failure to hold power. His arguments lit a pyre that eventually consumed his own influence. And so, history whispers, was his righteousness worth the cost of his downfall? Broaden the lens, and you'll see how these dynamics ripple across cultures and centuries. Lao Tzu counsels in the Tao Te Ching, "He who does not contend is never contended against." There is a sublime wisdom here. The ego that throbs for victory in argument is the very thing that binds us to suffering and defeat. When pride insists on winning each duel, we willingly step into traps of our own making. Now, think of Sun Tzu, whose stratagems rest on deception, patience, and a cultivated stillness. He advises, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. How often have you, in life's daily phrase, pressed your point and found only greater resistance? Strategic silence, the stillness of the forest before the storm, contains more true power than 1,000 shouted truths. Consider the samurai, practitioners of Bushido. Their composure in the face of provocation was legendary. What some mistook for passivity was in fact discipline. The discipline to act only when action was called for, to conserve energy and intention, to strike not with blind indignation, but with clarity and precision. Imagine how much suffering in your own life would dissolve if, instead of leaping into every quarrel, you practiced a warrior's non-reactivity? If you accounted for the hidden cost of every word, every reactive gesture. Modern psychology catches up with these ancient lessons. Take cognitive dissonance, the mind's tendency to harden its stance when confronted, not soften it. The more intense the debate, the deeper the trench that gets dug beneath each position. To argue is too often to forge your adversary's chains, and your own. Has any Facebook flame war ever yielded to mutual enlightenment? Or do both sides simply leave more entrenched, their original doubts banished by the embers of wounded pride? This all leads inexorably to some actionable advice, as practical as it is counterintuitive. When next you feel that old itch to leap into an argument, consider, might strategic withdrawal serve you better? What if your silence speaks volumes, denying your opponent any clear target, conserving your own energy for the rare conflict worth meeting head-on? Like water flowing around stone, let your actions, and sometimes your absence, do the talking. By refusing to fuel the fires of argument, you recover your initiative, restore your inner power, and, in the process, invite others to reflect rather than resist. How different would your daily existence be if, instead of compulsively defending every point, you embraced uncertainty and cultivated curiosity? What forest of possibility waits on the other side of restraint? Do you truly wish to win every argument, or simply to be heard, to feel understood, and, if fortunate, to influence the world in subtle, lasting ways? Machiavelli, Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, and the samurai all point us toward the same horizon, that it is not in the heat of argument, but in the quiet mastery of ourselves, that real power is born. But perhaps by now, the pulse of a question is stirring in your mind. Is it not only human to engage? When a friend misconstrues your intentions, a partner casts doubt upon your sincerity, or a colleague questions your qualification, doesn't the compulsion to defend yourself swell like a reflex, quick and irresistible? Let's pause and let that urge breathe for a moment. This need to explain, to justify, to set the record straight. Where does it come from? Is it a thirst for justice, or a fear of being misunderstood, or something subtler still? People often feel that to remain silent in the face of accusation or misunderstanding is to relinquish the power of their narrative, to allow someone else's version of reality to harden into fact. To argue, to lay out evidence, to find just the right words becomes not just a tool for resolution, but a means of restoring one's own sense of worth. Yet here lies a paradox. The allure of argument promises not only vindication, but also connection. To explain ourselves is, in a sense, to invite the other into our world, hoping they will finally see us clearly. But does this invitation always lead where we hope? When we step back, we realize that the machinery of argument is often less about illumination and more about domination. One person trying to bend another's perception into alignment with their own. Our justifications, initially meant to clarify, can calcify into defensive walls, behind which we become prisoners of our own ego. Have you ever noticed that the more fiercely you argue your case, the less willing others are to listen? The harder you push, the more the conversation becomes a contest of wills rather than a search for truth. Nietzsche, that restless provocateur, saw life as an arena of becoming, not simply of being right or being understood. His notion of the will to power is often misunderstood. It is not about domination over others, but about the creation and elevation of one's own life. Rising above petty conflict, Nietzsche suggests, does not signify weakness or submission, but an act of transcendence, a refusal to let the noise of argument define you. In the closing pages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche paints the image of a dancing star, a spirit so sure of its own light that it does not need to announce its brilliance, nor snuff out the flames of others. Dignity, he might argue, is preserved not by the force of our retorts, but by the mystery we cultivate when we decline to wrestle with every critic. There is something almost regal in restraint, is there not? Consider the legendary calmness of the samurai, or the cunning strategies described by Sun Tzu. They recognized that the greatest victories are often those won without a drawn sword, those battles where psychological offense is a matter of poise, and defense is as much about what one withholds as what one displays. The samurai prized composure, not just for the sake of serenity, but because it unsettled their adversaries. Sun Tzu, too, counseled, "He who is prudent and lies in wait for an enemy who is not, will be victorious." Calmness isn't about passivity. It is a veil behind which power gathers, silent but unmistakable. Let's turn the lens to the present. Consider the cycle of toxic arguments so prevalent in modern relationships. How often do conflicts end not with understanding, but with fresh ammunition for later confrontations? In these exchanges, the point is rarely resolution. Instead, the argument becomes a theater for emotional leverage, the silent tally of points won or lost, an unending struggle for a sense of control. We have all seen and perhaps lived the dance. Voices raised, grievances catalogued, the original hurt long eclipsed by the urge to win. In this game, the relationship itself becomes collateral damage. Does it ever truly lead to peace, or just a lull before the next eruption? This is where Stoicism's clear-eyed wisdom, as voiced by Marcus Aurelius, offers a way out. If anyone can refute me, show me I'm making a mistake or looking at things from the wrong perspective, I'll gladly change, he writes. It's the truth I'm after, and the truth never harmed anyone. To the Stoics, being right is secondary to being tranquil, untroubled by the chips and dents that come from collision with petty concerns. They teach the art of detachment, not from life, but from the ego's need to be champion, the need to have the last word. Buddhism, too, offers insight. The Buddha taught that attachment to views, especially the view of being right, is a root of suffering. Silence, then, is not surrender. It is an act of wisdom, a means of loosening the ego's grip and allowing space for something gentler, more honest to arise. When we do not clutch and claw for vindication, we enter into a deeper dialogue with ourselves and with reality, one where there is more to listen to than our own voice. Are these lofty ideas applicable in real life? Look to some of the most compelling public figures of our time. Think of Oprah Winfrey, so often challenged and scrutinized, yet rarely drawn into petty argument. Her presence is unshakable because it is grounded in restraint. You sense that she knows exactly who she is and does not need every slight corrected, every rumor refuted. Her silence, when she chooses it, is not indifference, but a statement of self-possession. Or consider the quiet dignity of Nelson Mandela in the face of insult and misunderstanding, his refusal to let bitterness or the compulsion to justify himself control the narrative of his life. So I invite you to imagine, if only for a day, what it might mean to lay down the weapons of justification. What would happen if, instead of defending every point, you let silence speak for you? What shifts in the room, in the relationship, inside yourself? Perhaps you discover that the peace you seek arrives not when your point is proven, but when your need to prove it fades away. That is when presence ceases to be something you must struggle to maintain, and instead becomes the natural outcome of your own inner clarity. Have you ever found yourself standing on the edge of a heated argument, wanting desperately to be understood, your voice tight with urgency, your heart pounding with the need to be heard? Perhaps you've wondered in that moment of crisis whether to defend your ideas to the very end or to simply step back, whether to fight for your truth or to leave words unsaid. This tension between speech and silence isn't just the stuff of everyday squabbles. It touches something ancient inside us all. Are we ever truly persuasive when the other person is unwilling to listen? What, if anything, is gained by wrestling with a closed mind? These are not just questions of etiquette or temperament. They are questions that cut to the heart of how we use our energy, where we find our power, and who, ultimately, we become in moments of conflict. To argue with someone who is not open, someone wholly unwilling to listen, is often nothing more than gifting away your strength. It is a subtle transaction, but a real one. Your energy, your composure, your sense of personal direction all seep away with every word spoken into the void. As you struggle, the other, a friend, a colleague, a family member, even a stranger on the internet, sometimes grows stronger, not because their position is wise or defensible, but simply because by engaging, you grant them the stage, the fuel, the gravity of your attention. Have you ever noticed how quickly you become emotionally enmeshed? How your pulse rises and your thoughts race, even as it becomes obvious that nothing is really being exchanged except the heat of opposition? Many have fallen into this trap. It promises the righteous glow of defending what we believe, but more often results in exhaustion, frustration, and a bitter aftertaste that lingers long after the dispute is over. The legacy is not growth or understanding, but a sense of diminishment. What could have been spent on creative work, self-reflection, or quiet joy has instead been poured into an endless tug of war, one that cannot be won. Is this what you imagine when you picture your best self? Yet these are not new insights. Through the ages, across continents and cultures, wise minds have considered the question of when to speak, when to fight, and, most critically, when to walk away. Think of Machiavelli, whose cynical realism cautioned rulers to conserve their energies to avoid unnecessary battles that drain the state and sap the spirit. Consider the Taoist sage Lao Tzu. He who conquers others is strong, he who conquers himself is mighty. For Lao Tzu, true mastery lay in restraint, submitting to the flow of things rather than pushing always against the current. Sun Tzu, in his Art of War, insists that the greatest victory is won without battle, that the wise commander knows when not to engage. The samurai, with their Bushido code, sought honor not only in combat, but in dignified withdrawal when it became clear that the encounter would be meaningless. The Stoics, too, taught that we must distinguish between what is within our power and what is not, that our peace, our very freedom, depends on letting go of our urge to force others to agree with us. Even today, in an age of endless digital debate and performative outrage, thoughtful communicators urge us to rise above the fray, refusing to give away our peace for the sake of a few hollow words. So, what does it mean in practical terms to walk away, to hold one's tongue, to let silence be your shield? The psychological rewards are immense. You do not become entangled in the emotional net of someone else's rigidity. You keep your self-control intact, your sense of mystery undisturbed. There is a kind of quiet dignity, even power, in withholding your response. Imagine for a moment a leader confronted by a critic's rant, a barrage of words, accusations, distortions. The leader listens quietly, then nods, turns, and leaves. Who holds the real power here? Who has set the terms of engagement? By refusing to be drawn in, the leader's silence speaks volumes. Or think of the seasoned teacher who watches a student's defensiveness with calm, declining to argue, instead letting the lesson impose itself through experience rather than persuasion. And here lies the paradox, perhaps one of the deepest paradoxes of power. Silence, absence, and restraint can wield more influence than any argument, however clever or impassioned. This is not simply a personal victory. Its ripples spread through families, workplaces, circles of friends, even societies and nations. Think of the times when cultural change was sparked not by shouting, but by principled silence. A march, a boycott, a refusal to answer injustice with more injustice. The world's most enduring shifts came not from those who argued endlessly, but from those who embodied a quiet integrity, their actions and their restraint filling the silence with undeniable presence. These moments invite us to consider a more radical form of power, one grounded not in conquest or conversion, but in calm self-possession. Instead of arguing with the unwilling, let your actions mirror your values. Instead of straining to persuade, let your life and character do the talking. How many times might a dignified silence have shifted a relationship, diffused a toxic exchange, or started a more meaningful conversation down the line? Ask yourself, when was the last time your silence was your greatest power? So, I invite you, no, I challenge you, to internalize this wisdom. Next time conflict flares and the urge to win rises within you, pause. Ask yourself what is truly to be gained. Muster the courage to withhold your words, to step aside, to let your composure and presence linger longer than any speech ever could. Let those around you puzzle over the quiet strength you radiate. Resist the urge to convince, and instead, let your silent dignity echo in the space you leave behind. Perhaps you already know the answer. Perhaps you have your own story, a memory of a moment when words would have failed you, but silence somehow carried the day. Reflect on these moments, share them, live them, become them. For in the end, our greatest eloquence is not in how we speak, but in when we choose to be silent. How will you wield your silence? Where might this paradoxical strength lead you? And what new power will you discover when you quietly, purposefully walk away?